Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism. Been a week since we last had a wee chat, and my goodness, what a week it's been. So much to talk about, and we will. And I've got a tremendous panel together this week to cover those topics. But before I do, a wee bit of housekeeping, if you could, I always forget, techies always have to remind me. If you haven't already subscribed for the show, please do. It means you won't miss another episode. And if you like what you're hearing and seeing, please hit the like button. It helps us with the algorithms on the YouTube. So without further ado, let me introduce my panel to you this week. We have, of course, from down in the borders, our good friend, Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Yvonne, my friend, how are you? Welcome back.
Thank you. Yes, it's been quite a strange week, hasn't it?
Oh, just a bit, but I'm sure we will have plenty of chat upon it. And we've also up there, we've got our friend Eva Comrie. Eva.
Hi, Roddy. Hi, Yvonne. Well, it's been some week.
Oh, for sure.
Probably one of those weeks of my life where I've been very relieved about certain decisions and certain stances that I took earlier and which I will continue to abide by. So looking forward to a good debate today.
Great stuff. And of course, we've got now the Coatbridge Cavalier, who is actually, would you believe, is over in North Dakota. Yeehaw! I expect you here with Stetson and 2 6 guns. You know. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's I've got the Stetson, funny enough. It was one of my dad's, so I'm intent in wearing it around, find a couple of cowboy bars and wander into them. But doing well, but this shambles just continues to shamble on. It's
good.
So
You
sad,
have been keeping
so
abreast of what's been going on.
It's tragic. It's absolutely what a mess.
It is. We'll get into it shortly. Well, also, I'm delighted to say we've got 2 newbies on the show. And the first one is Maggie Mellon, who is a member of the Sex Matters Advisory Group and a well-known women's rights campaigner. Maggie, welcome to Scottish Prism. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. I'm glad to be here. Hi, everybody.
And you're from Edinburgh. You're coming to us from Edinburgh. Yeah, someone's got to live there, you know.
This is Edinburgh in my kitchen. I'm from Glasgow, though. Born in Glasgow.
Best place to be born. I was in Rotten Row myself. We're also joined from Belfast by advocate John Moir. John, again, welcome to Scottish Prism and thank you for joining us today. Great pleasure to see you here.
Thank you very much for the invite, Roddy. Yes, in Belfast, but only currently over here for work. I'm currently a Fifer.
Oh, well, you're a Fifer we trust. So it's great. So it has been a heck of a week, folks, in the Scottish political scene. In fact, I don't think I've ever known a week like it. And if I could start with you, John, because while our viewers and listeners certainly understand what a Section 30 is, the Section 35 is fairly new. Could you run us through exactly what a Section 35 is and where and how it's applied?
Certainly. In one sense, Section 35 isn't new in that it's a part of the Scotland Act, which also contains Section 30. The new bit about the Section 35 is it has never had to come into operation before. What Section 35 is a provision that was set up in the Scotland Act, which set out the terms of setting up the Parliament to provide for a stopgap, really, if the Scottish Government were ever to pass legislation that either had an impact on national security or had an impact on reserved legislation. And up until now, since the Parliament has been set up, no one has had to be troubled by Section 35 because no previous government has been as foolish as the current one to pass legislation that everybody and his dog was telling them did have an impact on the rest of the reserved legislation, and in particular the Equalities Act. And so much that this government has done, their position was just no, it doesn't. And very much, it's a metaphor for the whole trans issue. Just because you say something often enough doesn't actually make it true. So there was a whole lot of concern right the way through the consideration of the gender recognition bill. It still remains a bill at this stage because although it was passed by the Parliament Holyrood, it has not yet been given royal assent. And that's really what the purpose of Section 35 is. It allows the Secretary of State, if he considers that it's appropriate to do so, to put a stop, an order on the presiding officer, preventing presiding officer from forwarding the bill for royal assent. I'll just quote the relevant terms of the section for you. It's the title of the section is the power to intervene in certain cases, and it provides that if a bill contains provisions, and I'll not mention those about international obligations or the interest of defence because those aren't covered, but it's the second part of section 1B that does apply here, and that's if a bill contains provisions which make modifications of the law as it applies to reserved matters, and which the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe would have an adverse effect on the operation of the law as it applies to reserved matters, he may make an order prohibiting the presiding officer from submitting the bill for royal assent. And there was quite a lot of speculation, particularly amongst lawyers, as to how the Westminster government would treat this this bill that was passed with much fanfare just before Christmas, and quite a few not so much well-known figures to the public, but well-known that within the realms of academia took a position that they thought that there were very good grounds for the intervention on Section 35 in this particular case. And
I don't think it was just academia. I think there was quite a lot of us.
Absolutely. There's a lot, but there was
who saw it as well.
Yes, absolutely. You know, and you know, I think myself amongst them, there's a lot of practicing lawyers felt it was it really that something needed to be done, but there was a very interesting, detailed legal analysis that was done by I think it's Michael Foran, his name is, at I think it's University of Glasgow. He wrote the piece for the think tank with a foreword from the former Advocate General Lord Keane, KC, and I think that was one that said a very strong case, and eventually much sort of trailing of would they, wouldn't they, the Secretary of State did come through indicated that he would be exercising Section 35, and there was published at the beginning of the week the document that set out his policy statement of reasons on the decision to use
Could I come
Section
back
30.
to you on that one, John? I'd like to come
Yes,
back
certainly.
to that shortly, but I thank you for that explanation, which I think will clarify things for our viewers. I mean, I wrote one a while back, a tweet, and I said the only people who are going to do well out of this bill will be the lawyers, because there was bound to be legal challenges anyway. Maggie, we've had discussions on this this forum a few times, and I said myself I'd been conflicted because there's two parts. I mean, one that wants independence and believes that we should be able to make our own decisions, and the other one where I was really and I remain opposed to this bill, and I was kind of conflicted. Did you find yourself conflicted, or were you happy that the Section 35 has been deployed by the government?
Yeah, well, I understand why you would feel conflicted, and I questioned myself seriously about it. But because I was an independence supporter, I was on the National Committee of Women for Independence. So on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, the Act is very clear. It's absolutely clear that a devolved Parliament can't be introducing legislation that actually interferes with UK-wide legislation. So that had already been agreed to by the SNP and everybody else. So it's part of a democratic process. The other thing is, I just think anything this Parliament does now, I regard with complete contempt, because the very fact that a majority of them voted for this, what's an abomination, really, leaves me with no respect for them at all, apart from the MSPs who very rightly spoke against it and voted against it. But I think that they've put any hope or cause or thought of people supporting independence back a long, long way, because to vote for something as stupid as that and to stand up and applaud a bunch of men in the galleries who'd been guising about in the women's toilets during the debates was just I'll never forget it. It's just appalling. So that's where I stand. I'm intensely relaxed about the government using Section 35. I think it's a shame, because people in Scotland should have stopped it. We shouldn't have elected MSPs that are so stupid, craven, and didn't follow any democratic process. The committee process was an abomination. The Parliament debate was ridiculous. So I think I'm ashamed of Scotland having MSPs like that and all the parties that supported it. That's where I stand on it.
A perfectly decent position to have as well, Maggie. Phil, 6 years Sturgeon and her crew have been mucking about with us, and here we are, she's driven it right into a cul-de-sac. Setting aside our views of the actual bill itself, surely sometime in the 6 years someone should have said, wait a minute, this could have difficulties. Plenty of people did tell them, but they didn't listen, did they?
Correct. But it's not just this issue. What she's doing is dragging the whole independence campaign into a dead end. That's the terrifying part of it, and that's the most pernicious. And there's something more to this. I mean, John set out Section 35 within the Scotland Act in a way that's clearly understood by all. That's been done before. That is understood when that legislation was put in place. And up until now, there's been no need to use this. Yet Nicola went ahead with a legislation that many told her was deeply and fundamentally flawed, especially, as John pointed out, 1B. But as usual, she doesn't listen. Maggie nailed it. And Kenny McCaskill spoke eloquently and accurately on Section 35 and clearly illustrated that GRR is not the issue to make a constitutional stand on. The referendum is. I mean, his speech in Parliament nailed it, and obviously he made a statement on the issue. But I think his statement was really good, because I'm going to quote Kenny here. At the very end, he says, if the SNP Greens wanted to mobilise opinion against Westminster interference in Scottish democracy, then the referendum was the issue. Failing to have pushed that let down the independence movement, and if they think they can rally the mass ranks on this, they are delusional. And this is where we're all struggling with this, because this SNP remain the vehicle for independence, but very, very quickly they're losing the right. They're certainly taking us for granted, our vote for granted, and more people are becoming aware of this betrayal. To take this and to die on this hill is absolutely crazy. The most important thing is that the independence movement doesn't die on it, just the careers of Nicola and those shysters that have taken us this far.
And Eva, the other thing that I found strange, now I obviously will bend to you and to John here on the legal side of it, but Nicola Sturgeon very quickly, and I mean a damn sight quicker than she did when the Supreme Court knocked back the independence referendum, she came out swinging, and she said, you know, she was going to appeal the Section 35. Now, if I'm not mistaken, your John can correct me, she can't actually, unless it's been applied incorrectly by the Secretary of State, you can't appeal the Section 35, can you?
No, the appeal is not the process. What she can do is she can seek to have his decision judicially reviewed, but that's a very different thing to an appeal. The key aspect in a judicial review is it's not the merits of the decision. What has to be examined particularly is whether the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe that the bill would have an adverse effect on the operation of the law as it applies to reserved matters. Now, again, I don't know if you want to deal with that now, but as you indicated earlier on, Roddy, Lord Hope, for one, formerly Lord President of the Court of Session before being elevated and ultimately became President of the Supreme Court before his retiral. His analysis is really pretty devastating on the suggestion that there's really any realistic prospect of success in challenging the decision of the Secretary of State, because it's...
Well, John, can I say that wouldn't stop her? She has got form in appealing things and going when she knows she's on a loser.
Absolutely, and I fully predict she will be as successful in this as she has been in those others, to the great expense of the Scottish public.
Absolutely. Eva, the other thing we can't overlook here is that the Tories have played politics with this as well, and that's, you know, bad. There is, I understand people say, well, they couldn't do anything until such times as the bill had been passed at Holyrood. But sure, they could have easily picked up the phone and said, this is not going to fly, do X, Y, and Z. They didn't. They waited. They gave them enough rope. Now, we could all see that coming. Why didn't Nicola Sturgeon see that she was being handed enough rope to hang herself?
Well, if I can slightly put this in a personal context, Roddy, the room that I'm sitting in is my favourite room in my house, and on the wall is a cartoon that I bought in 1994 in an auction at the SNP conference in Inverness. And above it is a picture I bid for at an auction in 2011, which is when the SNP got their majority. And beside it is a photo of my now deceased dad with my son, who was a baby then, and my niece, who was a toddler, and who are both now in their late teens. And so after my family, independence and the rights of vulnerable people have been the principles of my life, and they have been so dear to me throughout my life. So I was brokenhearted as well as very, very angry this week to see that the Tories did what they did because Scotland and the government elected by the Scottish people got it very badly wrong. And the process was wrong because we have a government which is out of control. Now, you can say that it was a democratic vote of the Scottish Parliament, but that depends very much on your definition of democracy. Nobody in the SNP can ever hold their head up again and say that they did what the people of Scotland wanted them to do by passing that bill, because their manifesto did not mention self-ID. I voted SNP in 2021 and I voted SNP again in 2022. Neither the Scottish parliamentary manifestos nor the local government manifestos mention self-ID. The two consultations have been hidden and botched. The second one in particular was not published. We have innumerable opinion polls showing what the position of the public in Scotland is once they know the truth and the implications. Those who voted for this bill lack principle, they lack understanding, they lack backbone, and most of all, they do not represent the will of the people of this country. And that shows you just how far the SNP have fallen from the party which was supposed to be a competent government designed to deliver a Scotland where everybody was equal, we had equal opportunities, where everybody's rights, responsibilities and freedoms were respected. And instead, the women and the children and the men who supported them, who were opposed to this bill, were told time and time again, "Hod your wheesht, your views are not valid. In our opinion, the Equality Act is not affected, and we can do this because it is a minor administrative change." It is an abomination, as has already been said, and I am heartbroken that a First Minister whom I helped to elect is responsible for making Scotland an international laughingstock and for giving the Tories the ability to wipe the floor with her once again.
Yvonne, a lot of SNP MPs, MSPs are saying, well, all the women's groups agreed with this. This we know is a blatant lie. The ones that agreed with it, as the Times has exposed, and it's another thing that's annoyed me, we have given our opponents such easy targets to hit. It was the only people that backed it were the ones that the government funded. People like for Women Scotland, they weren't allowed in. Sharon Davis, when she appeared, with female athletes, she wasn't allowed to give her opinion. And they're still standing there lying. There's no other word for it. They're lying and lying to the Scottish people behind the pretense of protection in Westminster.
What we're seeing is the demise of civil rights, equality and freedom of speech in Scotland. I've been asked to speak outside Bute House this next week, calling for Nicola Sturgeon to resign. And I don't know if I'll end up being arrested by Police Scotland simply for speaking the truth. I'll be giving a definition of what a woman is, which is something that a lot of MSPs and MPs are incapable of telling the world. I am so angry. I mean, I echo every single thing that Eva has said. And this whole journey since arriving in Scotland in 2011 has been a roller coaster ride. Last weekend, we had about 300 independence movement activists at the Alipur Party Special Assembly in Edinburgh. And that was a fantastic event, very positive, very optimistic. People were engaged, talking about issues that matter. And the issues that I'm talking about is what Eva was referring to, independence. I mean, when I came up to Scotland, the whole gender debate it was never mentioned. It would have sent alarm bells ringing, and I probably would have told the furniture van to do a U-turn if I'd heard about it.
Well, it's one point in life, the great thing to do is lobotomies were supposed to be the cure of all mental illness. And we look back now and go, how could that possibly have happened? I figure in a decade or so, people will look back and go, how the hell did that ever get legs and arms? And the reason is, of course, follow the money. John, to go back to Lord Hope, you've got the things that is there anything, it seems to me, the things that the Westminster's objecting to means that in effect, I cannot see a road back for this bill. The compromises that Nicholas, and she's already said, I will make no compromises, as she does, is there a way? There is no way this bill can survive. Is it now over? Is this finished?
Well, because this Section 35 has never actually had to be put into effect before, we are on virgin territory. We will have to see what the courts decide, but it's telling that someone of the stature of Lord Hope indicated that the challenge that is anticipated from the Scottish government is one that's barely stateable. Now, that's something that probably doesn't mean much to most people in the public, but a case that's stateable is one where you can, at least put forward an argument, but it probably is as low as you can get in terms of something that's likely to have any success. A case that's barely stateable. You can argue it, but it's going to be very difficult. And Lord Hope's view seems to be that the prospects of success of challenging the reasoning of the Secretary of State are really abysmally low, to the extent that he was concerned about the fact that it was just going to be a waste of public funds in trying to challenge this, because the bar to challenge it is so incredibly high. You've got to satisfy the court that no Secretary of State acting reasonable could possibly have reached the conclusion that the Secretary of State did in finding that this bill would impact upon, have an adverse effect upon the other reserved legislation.
Will this have to go to the Court of Session or the Supreme Court, John?
This will go in the first instance to the Court of Session. It's because what's happened at the moment is that Alistair Jack has made his order. That's been made, and unless that is successfully challenged or voted down at Westminster, then that effectually will stop the bill exactly where it is at the moment. It will remain to be a bill that does not get royal assent.
Yep.
It doesn't become law.
Yeah.
It's a bill that was passed by the Scottish Parliament, but in the same way as legislation in Westminster only become law when the royal assent is given. That also applies to all acts of the Scottish Parliament. And if the order that the Secretary of State, Alistair Jack, has made preventing the presiding officer from forwarding the act for royal assent, that means that it cannot become law.
Right.
Now, I would not be in the slightest bit surprised that if, as I think the majority of legal commentators think that this challenge by way of judicial review has incredibly poor prospects of success at the Court of Session, that the Scottish Government will want to take that further and on up to the Supreme Court. So it probably will end up with a decision of the Supreme Court that will be the ultimate.
And they're highly
decider
unlikely
here.
to give a decision against Westminster, are they?
I think they're highly unlikely to think that anything that the Court of Session has said is wrong.
Correct. More chance Albion Rovers were in the Champions League.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there has been this suggestion, as I think you adverted to earlier, about the possibility of whether anything could be done to
Salvage it.
amend the Act to make it compliant. But again, as Lord Hope said, and he was echoed in this by what Lord Keane said, who was the former Advocate General, he just didn't see that there was much prospect of doing that without really radical revisions, which I think would essentially probably gut the intention of the bill. Because really, on any basis, doing what they're doing, particularly in relation to pressing ahead with a self-ID and with reducing the age down to 16, it takes away so many safeguards and has such implications for the operations of the Equalities Act elsewhere, that it's hard to see how a Secretary of State saying, well, that doesn't seem to have much impact. I think that, without proper safeguards, there's always going to be a substantial impact on the Equalities Act in the rest of the country.
Could I just?
I was going to ask you, Maggie. The one thing I've noticed since this whole thing started, I've actually found that women are the most supportive of the gay community, of the trans community. That don't have a problem with it. What they've had a problem with all along is self-identification, mainly, but other things like, for example, giving GRCs to sex offenders, allowing people into the prison, women's prison estate. Could you see anything that they can amend that you, Maggie Mellon, would say, okay, I can accept that now? Is there enough amendments that could be made?
No, I mean, the whole purpose of the bill is to introduce self-ID of sex. So obviously, unless they took that out, there's absolutely nothing that could be acceptable about the bill. I think women generally, and like women who are feminists or progressive, do support the right of people to live their lives, as J.K. Rowling said, fully. But I mean, I'm not sure if there is a trans community as such, because what I see is a lot of very mixed up, confused, sometimes vulnerable, sometimes abused teenagers, many of them girls who've been sexually abused. I don't think they've got anything in common at all with men who are sexually aroused by the idea of themselves being dressed in women's clothing. And nor do those men really have anything in common with those very, very few men who are so miserable about the idea of having to live in a very sexed, gendered world that they don't, they can't identify at all with masculinity. Some of us feel the same about femininity, that it's all rubbish. That's why I'm a feminist, is because, or I don't even know if I'd describe myself as a feminist, but I'm absolutely for women's equality. But because one didn't want gender questioning children are now being told that means that they're in the wrong body, they're in the wrong sex. So that what I did want to talk about just to raise the issue of the ban on conversion therapy, which the government seems determined to go ahead with. And unfortunately, so does the Tories in Westminster have introduced their bill, or they're going to introduce the bill with putting banning conversion therapy for trans people, transgender, or people who believe they're in the wrong body, which I think puts the Tories in a really strange position, because what they're saying is that there is such a thing as a natural condition of being transgender, the same as being gay. Now there isn't. So, I do think that the Tories have got themselves in a real pickle there. They've contradicted. Either it needs a diagnosis and it's a disorder, or it's a problem, it's an issue, that's something that needs a diagnosis, or it doesn't. And they've actually got themselves with this Section 35, and all their arguments for Section 35 are kind of hold below the water if they don't actually hold to that position on the gender, on the therapy, conversion therapy ban. So I just think that's a problem. I'd be interested to hear what Eva maybe thinks about that, because that seems to me a contradictory position.
Phil, is there anything you can see that they could do to salvage it, that you would say this bill, okay, fair enough, I could live with that? Is there anything?
No, my position is I would repeal the original GRA, and I certainly want to see the Equality Act amended to make it very clear what the distinction is between sex and gender. Yeah. But I think the GRA is wrong to allow people to falsify a birth certificate. A birth certificate is a factual document. It should never be amended. And I mean, I'm a social worker, so we deal with adoption amends a birth certificate, but and I've got issues around adoption and current law on that. But to allow a legal fiction is wrong. So I think the GRA itself needs looked at, and that if we should never have accepted that. But everybody said, oh, this is it, be kind, this is the only solution, it's only very, very few people, and look what we've got now. We're told that we've got to absolutely give way on absolutely everything, it's a disaster for children, an absolute disaster what's being taught to children in schools.
Yep.
So it's not just this act, it's actually everything that sits underneath it. Things that have become
queer theory, isn't it, that's been proved?
Yes, things that have been allowed to happen and are being taught in schools. That John Swinney, when the Family Party guy stood up at a live webinar thing and started reading out the sex education material that's being taught to children in schools, John Swinney just about had conniptions and said, "This is going out live. This is people." And this is actually what's being taught to children in school. 7-year-olds are going to be asked what their gender identity is. So I think
what actually happened with that as well was that, this guy's family party, so you can just ignore him, killing because of the messenger, which is, you were absolutely right. He was telling the truth.
Yep.
And some people don't like the truth. Phil, talking that in children, I don't know if over there you saw Maggie Chapman being interviewed on LBC, where she thought it was fine for 8-year-old children to make a decision on their gender. Now, this is a person, an MSP, who thinks that 8-year-olds, 8-year-olds don't know if they want chips or hamburgers for their lunch. How the heck can they make gender decisions?
Well, they can, and what we've saw from John and Maggie, again illustrates that we've got considered legal opinion and expertise on this particular issue. That what we're actually having here from Maggie and there was a question by Kezia Dugdale and a disgraceful answer by Christina McKelvey. What this is in essence is the removal of safeguards. And that is unacceptable. That's what kills me. And what enrages me is tying in. We're handing easy victories to the Tories and to the Unionists. It's like fish in a barrel. We're turning our independence movement, which is inextricably linked to the SNP, into an easy target. And Kezia asked a question, okay, and the answer had to be heard to be believed. This gift to unionism. It's on Equally Safe Violence Against Women and Girls Fund. They have to prove their inclusion of LBTI or GBTI for organisations providing direct support for men before they get included in provision of funds for the protection of women and girls. Everyone who's put their name to this is a disgrace. It's the deliberate deconstruction of the SNP and our cause by a combination of blackmail by the state on a highly flawed Nicola and her cabal, the ideologically possessed and the downright cowardly. So Christina McKelvey et al., you have to go. It's not good enough. The safety of women and girls in Scotland cannot be left in your hands, and that is a disgrace, because this brings tragedy after tragedy. The people who really suffer here, that this will befall women and girls because of the idiocy of these charlatans. It enrages all of us, as it must, as it should.
Eva, do you think that good sense will prevail and that Nicola Sturgeon will let this bill fall, or do you think she will continue to try and push this through?
I would make a personal plea to Nicola Sturgeon, as a woman, as a disabled woman, as a lawyer who has acted for the best part of 40 years for women and children who've been vulnerable, who've been abused, who've been targeted and groomed by predators. I would ask her to search her conscience. I would ask her to be honest. And I would ask her, most of all, to consider what her motivation is when she knows, as well as I do, that a man cannot become a woman, and that her definition of trans and the reason why you would get a GRC under self-ID means that we no longer have a very small proportion of the population able to obtain a GRC. We have two things. We have, first of all, unlimited access to a GRC, because if I so felt like it, I could apply for one and say, well, hi, my name is Bob, and I'd like a GRC because I've been living as a man. I wear trousers, etc. That's how utterly ridiculous self-ID is. But the other aspect of this equation is this, that since at least 2011, the Scottish Government has known, because they fostered it, that self-ID has been in practice. In fact, it has been in guidance for hospitals, and it has been in guidance of the Scottish Prison Service for several years, and I would wager unlawfully. These are matters that have to be addressed, and I suspect that Ms Sturgeon has realised that self-identification has been in play, and she can't now roll back on it, because otherwise women like me, who might have been in a hospital ward with a male who ought not to have been there because he was self-identifying and had no GRC, and his gender reassignment protected characteristic trumped mine of my entitlement to single-sex space. We have a claim against her. There might be multiple claims. There are likely to be female prisoners in prison in Scotland today or in the past few years who have claims for the trauma experienced by having to participate in a process whereby intact male bodies were there unlawfully. So do I think she will change her mind? Not a chance. And the reason for this in part is not just her stubbornness, it's also because it's not costing her a penny personally, unlike my clients who cannot see their children, whose children might be in care, who might be fighting against an ex, might be fighting the social work service, might have difficulties with mental health, alcoholism, drugs, poverty, hunger, you name it. They have to jump through hoops to get legal aid to take an action to court. They can't just say, give me legal aid, I want you to do something about this, Eva. What we've got to do is show we've got a case, just cause, standing, indicate that we've exhausted all reasonable steps to prevent going to court, show that we've negotiated, show that we've listened to the other side. Before then, we get a legal aid certificate with an initial limit on it of a couple of grand. And here we've got a First Minister determined, it seems, to fling away hundreds of thousands of pounds on court actions that she's doomed to lose time and time again, because she won't listen to the independent legal advice that she ought to take.
There's a a certain irony, Yvonne, that, you know, for all these, we've been complaining, we independence supporters on here have been complaining that there's not been enough action on independence. Instead, she was trying to reverse the Brexit decision in England. The hypocrisy of that still irks. Us trying to overturn a democratic decision of English voters, ridiculous. She's done 6 years on this. If she'd stuck to independence, there could be no Section 35 order. She would have got this through. So if she'd stuck to the core principles of the original SNP, this wouldn't have been a problem for her. So she's made a road for her own back, has she not? Beating herself.
Can I step in here just on that?
Once Yvonne's answer
sorry.
that question.
Yes, I have. Well, she knows that the end is nigh, but she, in her arrogance, she still is incapable of saying, sorry, I got it wrong. I took the focus off independence. You know, we're all forgiving people. If she just threw herself at the mercy of others and honestly said what I've just said now, that she's, the trouble with Nicola Sturgeon is she has surrounded herself by people who don't know their arse from their elbow, putting it politely. And
technical term.
Really, you know, they don't understand what's going on. There is bonkers as the people who allowed a transgender man who calls himself Karen, and he was sent to prison, and during his time in custody in a woman's prison, he did what many of us would say, well, is predictable, and he was involved in indecent assaults and gross indecency. And this is not supposed to happen. When confronted with these issues, Nicola and her acolytes just say, oh, no, that doesn't happen. Well, it does happen. And it happens time and time again, because somebody makes the decision that a transgender bloke will be perfectly safe in a woman's prison. Well, he might be safe, but the women aren't. And, you know, we're talking about vulnerable people. There's nobody more vulnerable than women prisoners. Most women are in prisons because of some bad behavior by a man in their life. Most of them have had appalling childhoods, abusive relationships, and they're put in prison supposedly for rehabilitation. And what happens? They're locked up with some bloke called Karen who has a string of sexual convictions as long as you're on. It's, you know, who are these idiots that put this man in a woman's prison? The trouble is, today there is no accountability. Nobody is prepared to stand up and say, that's my fault.
John,
we get outraged when children that are in the care of social services end up being abused and killed, and they fall through the net. But at the moment, there is absolutely no compassion or sympathy for women who are locked up in prison.
Yeah. And there's no net for them either. No safety.
But many of those children who are in care, not many, but a lot of children who've experienced abuse in care, they go into prison, and they're going to actually be in prison with the men who are rapists. There's a trial in Glasgow just now of a man accused of raping 2 women who's decided to declare himself female for the purposes of the trial. Now, I think, Nicola, a lot was made about that she didn't want Kate Forbes to vote. I actually think they knew there's a scandal a day coming over gender. There's that man, if he gets convicted, will be sent to, well, I'm not sure, if the GRR was actually became law, that man would automatically have a right to go to a women's jail. There's a rapist who's now preparing for release and is demanded to be put in the women's prison in order to prepare for release as a woman. Now, I think that's only the what do you call it, the tip of the iceberg. There's far more scandals. There's children in care who are being searched as male because they identify as a boy. They're being searched by male police constables as males because that's their right. I mean, these are girls who are actually fleeing from being female because it's so dangerous. And this is, this is what's happening, and nobody is challenging these things. So, I think there's a scandal a day. The reason they pushed for it before Christmas is the news every day now is about rapists, murder, who are actually wanting to identify as female. And they actually voted in the Parliament to allow it. They defeated an amendment that would have stopped sex offenders, which means the Parliament's gone a long way back from when Johan Lamont was able to put a motion to replace gender with sex, and they were ashamed into having to support that motion and amend the bill, the Forensic Medical Examination Bill. Now we've got a Parliament that actually voted to allow sex offenders, rapists, to enter women's prisons and pose as women.
Yes, adult human females. John, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it was principally on the issue that was being discussed about how Nicola Sturgeon had lost focus on the independence issue for this. For me, there's not much in the way of silver lining about this, but there is one that I can identify. And cards on the table, I was a staunch no voter in the independence referendum, principally because of my concern that would take Scotland out of the EU, which was the one of the central planks for the No campaign, and I believe that to be the case. And obviously, I was sold a lie on that because the Brexit situation, despite all the lies that were told in that, which was that it would still be part of the single market and all the rest of it, it turned into something completely different. And despite Scotland voting to remain in the EU, that vote was subsumed within the general UK vote, and the vote of the majority English was to take us out of the EU. So that card on that table. But I think the one thing that is absolutely glaringly obvious from the passage of this bill has been to show up the utter deficiencies of the supposed committee scrutiny of legislation in Scotland, and it absolutely flagging up the need for something far stronger than that. We need to have, if there is to be any form of independence, a proper revising chamber to look at legislation, because it's quite apparent that for this legislation, despite all the claims it was the most scrutinised legislation and it took 6 years and all the rest of it, it was most of the supposed scrutiny went on at the committee, and it was an absolutely stacked committee full of people who were utter advocates for the legislation. There were, Tories that were on there that would consistently try and make positive and realistic challenges or interventions, and they just never really got a look in. And particularly because the committee were the ones who were gatekeeping who they would hear from. and they picked and chose the
Sure.
people that agreed with them. Anybody that disagreed with them wasn't called to give evidence. And the
Correct.
absolute disgrace that the day before the Parliament actually sits down to debate the passage of the bill was the first time that the UN expert on violence against women and girls was called to speak to the committee. And there was a hasty return to the committee from their expert that agreed with them. Victor, I can't remember his last name, but his position was, in my view, it was one that was entirely disingenuous. I don't know if you're aware, but the LGBT Alliance have put in a formal complaint to the UN in relation to his position, both to the Scottish Parliament and in general with regard to his exercise of his office on the basis that he is advocating almost exclusively for trans rights and totally ignoring his responsibilities for lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. You know, it was the Scottish government that wanted to hear from him again to try and knock back what the expert on violence and women and girls was saying, and that just showed just what an absolute sham the whole scrutiny process of the committee was. In relation to what's been said about the issue of male or biological male prisoners who identify as women and having a right to be transferred into women's prisons. A lot is said about the fact that there are risk assessments, but what most people don't know is that the risk assessment is the risk to the male prisoner. The risk for the women in the prison he's to be moved into isn't a factor.
If it wasn't so tragic, John, it would be very funny. It would be. Phil, how much damage has been done to the independence caused by this?
It's immeasurable at the moment. We are now in a position, tragically, where we have to deconstruct the vehicle that took us so close in 2014, and for reasons that John's just articulated, the tide was turning naturally because of the development within the United Kingdom, which is down very, very much disunited. Brexit, coming out of Europe. There's so many issues now. The gift of Boris, which looks like he might be on a return trip since he's just went into Davos. There's so many reasons now, so many more reasons that the erosion of our rights, pensions, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, the list goes on and on as to reasons why there should be a massive increase. It should be a slam dunk. And yet, because of issues like this, because of the infiltration of the SNP and the undermining of the SNP and the enabling of this by those within the SNP small cabal that manage it, and Nicola and her group are responsible for this, we now are in a situation where, yes, it continues to increase, or we're hovering around the 54%, as a recent survey showed. But we won't know how much damage this has caused until we start seeing results in elections. But the problem is we need to clear our feet and we need to get rid of the negativity and that which detracts from independence, because independence is the only thing under which we can fix everything by the people, for the people. It's about the people of Scotland making these decisions for ourselves, that suits ourselves, which means probably going back in with EFTA. But I feel that she and this cabal have damaged our cause so much that she has to go, and there has to be root and branch change in the SNP. We have to get people like Kenny McCaskill, people who actually understand these issues legally from a legal perspective. Listen to the experts, Nicola, not these ideologically possessed children. You don't surround yourself with sycophants. Every business person knows you surround yourself with people who are good, who make you look good, who make your business work, who do and deliver that which you aspire to. So, Nicola, no, you've betrayed us, and you've destroyed the impetus that Alec handed her when he handed over the keys to the city. She really has. So, to the extent we won't know, but one thing's for sure, I don't want to find out. I don't want to put the independence movement at risk and die on this hill that Nicola's marched us up on. It's a disgrace.
Yeah, absolutely. Time's beginning to beat us, Eva and Yvonne. I'd like a couple of comments from you both before we go. Phil's alluded to, Eva, any other walk of life, the CEO of a company, if there is so many failures, like the Named Persons Act, we'll go back to it, the OBFA getting turned over, the GRR, the carry on with Alex Salmon, the judicial review, what's happened in education, what's happening in justice, which is probably another whole programme I could do with you, John, on all the screw-ups that have happened in justice. The buck should stop with the person at the top of the tree, and she would be removed if it was a PLC company for all this failure and waste of funds. It's malfeasance, he said, not pronouncing it very well.
It's exactly what it is. And the difficulty is that the independence movement remains well and thriving despite Nicola Sturgeon. But the integrity and the courage and the decency and the leadership is no longer in the party of government. I will remind viewers, but especially Miss Sturgeon and her friends, that same-sex marriage was introduced in 2014, having been actively promoted by Alex Salmond.
Correct.
So you need look no further than the leadership of the ALBA party for courage, strategy, ideas, decency, and the understanding of the need to safeguard and protect human rights. Because for all that is in the grassroots of the SNP and of the independence movement, those attributes seem no longer to be in government.
But in fairness, Yvonne, Nicola did give us baby boxes. She's well, you're on mute, Yvonne. I just got to throw that hand grenade at you to let you go.
Sorry, that was me being self-restrained. You'll never know what I actually said. But
I can imagine.
To hell with the baby box. Nicola Sturgeon's problem is she has to walk in the steps of Alex Salmond, who, is a giant in politics. And we see that every time he gets to his feet and he talks. And he led probably the world's most progressive government of its time at the start of the 21st century. And this is a legacy that she is finding too difficult to follow. Instead of just, she had the easiest job in the world. All she had to do was get on the same horse and just go G up and get on with it. She had the easiest job in the world. It was laid out for her. And she cocked up. Alex Salmond got us the referendum with 6 MPs. She
had 56 at one point.
56 at one point. And all that we got from them was the blessed baby box. and this divisive GRR bill, which I have to say, I've spoken to a couple of transgender people who are fed up to the back teeth of what she has done, because she has put an unwelcome spotlight on them. And, you know, they just want to go about their lives quietly, without fuss, without any fanfare. And now this has happened.
Yeah, I saw a tweet today, last thing. He said, a gay man, he said, I was in retirement. He said, but I feel I've got to come out because all this JRR stuff has made us hated again. When I thought it had all gone by the wayside. And you're right, that's what's happened. But listen, folks, I really, much as I hate to, and I know some of our viewers will be complaining, we're going to have to draw a close because we've gone on just a bit too long. Can I thank you all? Absolutely. John especially, and I really would, John, at some time like to get you back to talk to you about some of the things that have gone wrong with Scottish justice and the police force, etc. I think it would be a good programme all on its own. Thank you for being here. Thank you for explaining Section 35 and for your input. Greatly appreciated. And to you, the three, as usual, thank you for your input. Next week, we'll be going even more exotic for you. I will be coming to you from Dubai. Where I'm going to go and see my grandbabies, and I can't wait. I'm leaving in a couple of days. And we'll speak to you soon. But until we do, you and yours, please, please, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Bar